Unlike most of my colleagues, I believe that consciousness is fundamental. It's not something which emerges from processing in the brain or in a computer or somewhere else. According to this interface theory of perception, we do not perceive reality, we perceive what's useful to us and not what is independently true of us. In terms of space and time, for example, then there's virtually zero probability that this aligns with, so to say, the true structure of the world.
Dr. Robert Prentner is a philosopher and consciousness researcher interested in understanding the mathematics that underpin reality. He is a believer in the interface theory of perception, which states that we do not see reality as it is. Everything we perceive is an icon on our interface, which helps us navigate and survive an unpredictable world. Alongside famous cognitive psychologist Donald Hoffman, they mathematically proved that reality is an illusion, an idea laid out in Donald's wildly influential book, The Case Against Reality. Remember, the only true way of understanding the true nature of reality is to subscribe to the channel. What can we say, or can we say anything about the objective nature of reality? I guess the big question.
Yes, exactly. That's the big question.
Is consciousness more fundamental than physics?
Oh, yes, definitely.
I'm getting the sense from you that you don't think consciousness has anything to do with biology at all.
Yeah, yes and no.
Do you think that AI can be conscious?
Artificial intelligences could be a manifestation of consciousness, such as I and my brain are a manifestation of consciousness.
Right.
Doesn't mean that it is conscious or that it produces consciousness. But I also wouldn't say that my brain is conscious, so to say. My brain is an interesting representation of certain processes which are going on, which are indicative of consciousness. But that doesn't mean that inside my brain there is something like consciousness or so. And in the same sense, I would say that that could be true for AIs and also maybe for already existing AIs.
Dr. Robert Prentner, when I look at my hand, when I'm looking at you, when I look around my room, am I perceiving reality as it is?
No. There's almost zero chance that you don't perceive reality as it independent of the relation that you have to your environment and to all the other cool things are. So in my work, I'm interested in understanding the relation between consciousness and our sense of physical reality. And unlike most of my colleagues, I believe that consciousness is fundamental. It's not something which emerges from processing in the brain or in a computer or somewhere else. And one point of departure is what you just referred to, is the so-called interface theory of perception. And according to this interface theory of perception, we do not perceive reality, or we perceive reality as it is for us in terms of fitness or in terms of useful relations, right? We perceive what's useful to us and not what is independently true of us. So when you say you perceive some processes in space and time or whatever, then according to the interface theory of perception, those are just very useful ways of structuring sensory information.
Give us an example of what an interface. What do you mean exactly by the word interface in this theory of perception?
Yes. So one metaphor, which was introduced at length by my colleague Don Hoffman, is the metaphor of a desktop interface. So the way how perception works, according to this metaphor, is similar to the way how we interact with our computers with a desktop. So we have icons on a desktop and we can do cool stuff with these icons. We can drag and drop them and we can write emails and whatever. But those icons do not mirror or show us directly the underlying reality of the computer. And that's a metaphor for the way how our perception works. So according to the interface theory of perception, perception is like a desktop, like a computer desktop that allows us to do various cool things. But similar as the desktop, it doesn't show us what's running underneath those icons, so to say. So when you see a trash can on your desktop, then of course everyone would agree there is no literal trash can in front of you. And according to the interface theory of perception, That's not only true for cool things which you can do with a computer, for engineering tricks, but that's the way how perception is structured more generally.
Can you give, because it's such a cool idea, and it's one that's fascinated me for a while. Can you give maybe one or two of the best pieces of evidence that you have for why you and Donald Hoffman believe our perceptual system work in this way?
Sure. So one of the things which one of the research areas which got that whole idea of thinking about things started were actually computer simulations. So what my colleagues 15 years ago actually did was to design computer games, so game theoretic simulations on a computer. Evolutionary game theory, it's a way of mathematically building a model or building a mathematical model of the evolutionary process, which you can simulate on a computer. Now, my colleagues did that for organisms which needed to compete for certain resources. And they found those strategies or those ways of representing the world around them, which was not tuned to the structure those resources had, so which were not truthful, helped the organisms to outcompete the others. So the most successful strategies or representations in that game were actually not what perception scientists would call veridical perceptions, truthful ways of representing your environment. So that was one kind of evidence. Second one, which happened a bit later, were actually mathematical theorems. So ways how these ideas were fleshed out in mathematics. So there were two theorems, and I was involved in working on one theorem. The first theorem basically just said that if you take an evolutionary game, then those strategies which are tuned to what's called a fitness function will be those strategies which survive in the end. Now, the second theorem, which I was involved in, said basically, if you look at the structure of those functions, there's a certain probability, which goes to zero, that the structure of those functions actually preserves or mirrors, so to say, the true structure of the environment.
Fascinating. It's so cool. And I think this is an intuitive idea for people, that we evolved so that the environment is beneficial for our survival and not so that we can see it as it really is, if there is such a thing as an underlying reality, which we will get to. Do we have an idea how accurate our perceptions are? Were you able to figure out in those simulations if in some circumstances fitness and reality were correlated or aligned in some way? Like, I would have assumed that those things would actually be correlated at times, just even by coincidence, and then be not correlated at times. Were you able to sort of parse those things apart and figure it out?
Yes, so the natural intuition that we all have, or that most of us have actually, is that just because we perceive the world truthfully, our perceptions are fit or useful, or whatever you want to use here. So we have this intuition that basically fitness and truth kind of align. And one way to interpret the results which I and my colleagues got is to say that, well, what's the probability to have such an alignment? What's the probability that a fit perception is also a true perception? And here we found that the larger the more complex the perception gets, the lower the probabilities that those two things align.
Interesting. So what do you
So
mean
if
by
you
the
take
more
our perceptions in
complicated?
terms of space and time, for example, then there's virtually zero probability that this aligns with, so to say, the true structure of the world.
Interesting. So what is a basic perception then? So a basic perception is I have a glass of water in front of me, and that's visual system, that's visual perception. Is that likely to be a faithful perception because that's very basic, or is that not very basic and that's actually a lot more complicated than it seems?
Well, I would say it's already quite a complex perception actually. So according to the framework that this theory is framed, a basic perception is very similar to what people call a representation. Now, I must say, not all perception scientists actually believe in representationalism. So there's a minority minority fraction which says, okay, no, that's not a good way to think about perception. But I also think that the basic interface theory also holds for the minority here. But that's just a side comment. So I would say, to answer your question, a very basic form of perception is just, I don't know, if you look at a bacterium, and it has one environmental sensor and it gets some information. It's salty out there, or it's not salty. That's a very basic perception. And even here, the chances that somehow mirrors whatever objective reality is like is very small.
Right. And there's actually mechanisms.
So typically we will have this situation that, you have a resource, let's say salt or water, and few water is not good, but too much water is also not good. So there's a Goldilocks zone in between. But if you have a perception which is just yes, no, then that will be automatically tuned to something which doesn't resemble the true structure of this resource.
Right. So there's also mechanisms in our brain that are making very complicated perceptions seem easy, seem simple, and seem very tangibly in front of us. So like our perceptual system is deceptively simple to us, but that's all just because all of that complication is abstracted away. There's also, mechanisms there to make sure that we don't fully encapsulate how chaotic and complex it is. It seems simple and real to us.
Yes, and that's a basic property of the theory. So the interface theory of perception. What are good interfaces? Well, good interfaces are those interfaces which hide a lot of complexity, because we are kind of limited beings, so we need to have as simple as possible representations to actually do something with them. So a lot of computing power probably is going into the creation of what appears to be simple, even though it might not be simple. So if you look what the brain is doing, so if you limit yourself to visual perception, then there's really a lot of stuff going on. And the question would be, if the brain just faithfully represent what's there, then why is there so much stuff going on?
So I had Anil Seth on the podcast a few days ago, and I was incredibly excited to talk to him as a world-renowned consciousness researcher. And we talked a lot about the predictive theory of perception in the brain, that our brain is making predictions of our environment based on the models that we have constructed. And then basically sensory input is controlling those models and creating a sensory prediction error feedback loop. And this all made a lot of sense to me, and I think there's some strong evidence that this is also how it works. The interface theory of perception doesn't seem too at heads or too in contrast to this predictive theory of perception in that Anil Seth speaks about. Am I correct there, or where do they really clash?
Yes, you're basically correct. And I mean, Anil is a great scientist, and he's a great researcher in consciousness science. Well, and you're right. I mean, predictive processing and an interface theory of perception are very similar in many respects, but there's also a big difference. And the difference is that the interface theory, so predictive processing basically would say that's a top level story of what the brain is doing, right? It's about what the brain is implementing, which kind of algorithm is the brain doing. And the interface theorist goes one step further. It would say, okay, no, there isn't really a brain in a sense, because space-time, objects in space-time are not existing independently of perception or consciousness. Maybe we'll come later to that. So there's this point where those two theories converge. One could say one way of framing it would be to say, okay, you have predictive processing, and predictive processing, is a real cool theory, and it explains what the brain is doing, but then it stops, so to say. And the interface theory goes one step further. It says, okay, what's the implication for reality as such?
So it's kind of walking that theory a couple of more steps down the line, which really goes into the kind of crazy territory of complicated and difficult to understand. And it's making a lot more all encompassing claim about how really the whole fabric of reality and the universe comes together and how that combines with consciousness.
Yes, definitely. I think that's fair to say. I mean, especially when you look at consciousness, which is really the crucial element, which both Emil Seth and I am interested in, then the role of consciousness in those theories is slightly different.
Yes. So what does consciousness being fundamental mean? And I know this is going to get very complicated, but I really don't understand what that means to say that the brain doesn't create consciousness. You know, I did a research project on consciousness in college. I studied neuroscience, and I've always thought about consciousness as an emergent property of incredible complexity in the brain. You know, 86 billion neurons, trillions of synaptic connections. And in that web of complexity, you get this emergent property that we don't understand called consciousness. Where do you disagree with that?
Well, it's kind of useful at this point uh, to introduce several distinctions that are typically made in consciousness science,
Please.
and um, so that goes back to a distinction which was published like 30 years ago, where we distinguish between which is called access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Where access consciousness is really about how information is processed, how it is made available, how it can be used. And phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, it's really about the subjective sense of experience that we have when we experience or when we perceive the world outside. Those are the two distinctions that we make, that one can make. And I would agree, or at least I would say it's a very interesting research program to say all there is to access consciousness is what the brain is doing. It's a top level description of what the brain is doing, or at least some of the things that the brain are doing, having certain processes which produce access consciousness. And then there are different theories in neuroscience how that's actually done. Um, Despite this being very interesting and thought-provoking and everything, it still leaves somewhat open this question about phenomenal consciousness. So there's
Right.
this, you probably have heard this phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. There's still this question, why does all this information processing that's going on in the brain somehow leads to subjective phenomenal experience? And it's actually even worse. We would say that given all that we know, there's no reason that we should believe that there is something like phenomenal consciousness at all when we look at what the brain is doing. So, I mean, if I have a computer here and there's some information processing happening in my computer, I don't have the natural intuition that it's subjectively like something for the computer. But it somehow we have this intuition now, but for humans or for animals at least, it's the case, or this is the case. Now, if you say something like, or if I say something like consciousness is fundamental, then that entails that there's no direct entailment between this access sense of consciousness and the phenomenal sense of consciousness. So that means whenever a system is access conscious, if and only if a system can be access consciousness, you can make a certain bridge to phenomenal consciousness. That's not necessarily the case. So a lot of neuroscientists who study consciousness study this access form of consciousness and then somehow stipulate that it also it causes or produces, or whatever metaphor you want to take, this phenomenal sense of consciousness. But there is no really need, or no real logical justification for why you do so. Now, on the other hand, if you say consciousness is fundamental, or at least if you believe some sense of consciousness, this phenomenal sense of consciousness is fundamental, you might get to a very different hypothesis, to a different theory, and that's closer to what interface theorists, for example, would assume. So they would say, okay, consciousness, this phenomenal sense of consciousness, is some basic ingredient into how the universe works, and in certain complex systems, like the human brain, that leads to this creation of interfaces. And that's where access consciousness is happening. On the other hand, if you don't take consciousness to be fundamental, you would say, okay, there's the brain, there are certain complex material systems, and they do something, and then, like, voila, phenomenal consciousness is coming out of it.
Yeah. Well explained. Really, really well explained. And I know I'm challenging you to talk about incredibly complex topics with accessible language, and I think you're doing a really good job at that. So is the interface theory of perception, is that a panpsychism idea? Does it come along the lines of that there is a spectrum of consciousness, and even down to the level of atoms, there is a very tiny amount of consciousness there? Is that what consciousness being fundamental means?
Well, yes and no, actually. So, I mean, you introduce panpsychism, which is a very interesting philosophical theory, doctrine, which would say that consciousness, a very broad way of reading panpsychism would be to say consciousness is ubiquitous in the universe and is fundamental. In that sense, that would count as panpsychism. Now, there's a narrower sense of panpsychism, which you appeal to probably, namely this idea, okay, there's somehow consciousness inside this cup, or inside the atoms of this cup. Now here the interface theory would be a bit more skeptical. It would say, okay, well, this idea that there is this cup with an inside, whatever that means, is actually not true. According to the interface theory, there doesn't exist such a thing. So there cannot be consciousness inside it. So when panpsychists would say something like, okay, there is consciousness which can be found in atoms, or I don't know, tables and rocks or so, then the interface theorists would be very skeptical. We would say, okay, all those things are just icons on your interface. It makes no sense to ask what icons have inside of them, and they're just icons on the interface. So in that sense, it's clearly opposed to some versions of panpsychism. But in a more broader sense, it is a version of panpsychism, I would say. And I personally have a lot of sympathies with panpsychist philosophers. So I wouldn't want to ridicule it at all. So I think it's a very interesting proposal.
Right. To get clear about what you mean by icons, so again, like a glass is an icon, or maybe multiple icons. Correct me if anything I say is in any way inaccurate, but a glass is an icon, a mug is an icon, the coffee residue that's still in the mug is an icon, the sound that I hear from my neighbor is an icon, my neighbor is an icon. Are icons just absolutely everything, not just in our visual perception, but in our auditory perception, in our sense of time? Does icon encapsulate all of it?
Yes, I would say they encapsulate all of those things which your brain comes up with, so to say, all those nice stories, all those predictive theories, if we want to connect to predictive processing, that the brain comes up with our icons. But not everything that exists is an icon, right? So if you believe that consciousness is fundamental, then that entails that it's not just an icon, and that it's somehow part of reality or all of reality beyond those icon building business, so to say.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
here's where the interface theory, or theories like the interface theory and predictive processing theories, for example, disagree. So in predictive processing, depends a bit on what kind of variety. One would say, okay, consciousness has something to do with the best guess that the brain has at one level of the hierarchy. Whereas in interface theories, you would say, okay, no, those are icons for consciousness, about consciousness. But consciousness itself is not an icon. It has nothing to do with this icon business which goes on in the brain.
Does the interface theory of perception make any claims about the animal kingdom and consciousness as a whole? Does it say that bacteria are conscious, that all animals are conscious? What sort of claims does it make about the animal kingdom and consciousness?
So a couple of claims, actually. So one claim which I find very interesting, according to the interface theory of perception, is categorical distinction, which we tend to draw between non-living things and living things is a distinction which exists on the interface.
Right.
And that's a kind of radical way, because even in a, let's say, now in a very, let's say, intellectual liberal position, people tend to, say, okay, no, a lot of things are actually conscious, even down to bacteria. But the interface theorists would say, well, it's even a bit more radical than that. So this distinction that there is a domain of living beings, that's just an epistemological knowledge-related limit to our interface. That's not some distinction which is true of reality as such.
So you don't think that you think life is something being living is a language construct. It's something that we've invented, but there's fundamentally nothing really different there between a human being and a table in terms of there's no magic sauce, there's nothing secret. It's just orders of complexity.
Well, I would say there's no magic sauce, but I wouldn't say it's just an invention of our language or something like that. I think it's not a social construct, right?
Yeah.
A table is a table, independent of whether I speak Chinese or not Chinese, or German or English. It's independent of my cognitive abilities. There seems to be some difference between it, and that probably has to do with the way how uh, with certain complexities which exist there. But I would say that's a very standard approach. So if you ask a chemist, for example, who is interested in this question of what's called abiogenesis, so how uh, living systems emerged from non-living chemical systems, then they will tell you, okay, but those living systems are really just chemical systems which are interesting, which do interesting things that other systems don't do. And that's really just physical systems which do interesting things which other systems are not doing. Um, so to draw a strict boundary seems somewhat arbitrary given physics and chemistry. And the interface theorists in some sense agree. He would say, okay, saying one is conscious and the other is not conscious seems to be arbitrary. They're both equally conscious or equal representations of consciousness. That would be the more correct thing to say. But one is just a very not complex representation of consciousness, a very dumbed down version, so to say, and the other not. It has much more to do with the way how we as a species evolved interface representations, but it's not something which mirrors some basic structure in reality beyond those interfaces.
I think that can make that's an intuitive thing for people. Is there a way to measure consciousness that is predictive or useful in the world? Can we measure the degree of consciousness that something has? Say, even comparing a 30-year-old adult to a 1-year-old child, there's likely differences to the extent of consciousness there. Can we measure it yet in any sort of tangible, useful way?
Right, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it would be nice to have something like a linear scale on, like 0 is not conscious and 10 is very conscious, and then you have 100. But
Right.
probably that's not the way how it works. First of all, I guess something would be multidimensional. There are very different ways in which to think about these things. But ultimately, I would even say that this whole idea of measuring consciousness is very difficult. What we could do, what you probably hopefully could do, is to measure, to quantify certain ways how consciousness is manifested in the world. Like if you think, how is consciousness brought to you in your interface representation, there may be different signs of consciousness that might appear in the interface. So in that sense, you can measure it, right? You could, and that's very similar to this boundary between non-living and living things, like the conscious and the non-conscious thing. Sometimes you see this way, and there's certain suggestions, there's certain proposals for that, like the capacity of integrating information, for example. That could be one way how to measure what's happening on the interface.
Okay. So I think it's fair to understand the physical icons that we touch are distinct from reality because it was more fit for our sensory system to evolve for fitness rather than reality. I think that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
The items in our environment are a construction. What's, I think, really mind melting, and where my capacity to understand this thing kind of just hits into a wall, is that space and time itself are a construction. Can you try and explain what that even means as a sentence?
Well, actually, that's quite an old idea, really. I don't know, philosopher Immanuel Kant said something like this, and probably many people before him said something like this. So this idea that space and time, there's this famous Einstein quote which says, "Space and time are really the ways how we think about the world, and not the ways how the world is," so to say. So that's quite an old idea, and it just means that just one of the ways how it could be understood, according to the interface theory at least, is to say that space and time are very good structures or data structures for the kind of information that we get. So it's a way how we structure um, the various kinds of information that we collect about the world. Maybe the best structure that we could come up with. But that doesn't mean that reality as such has the structure of space and time. It's just a very, very clever and useful way how we do it.
Because, like, physical matter exists, right? I mean, no matter, like, I can't run through a wall, so that wall exists in an objective sense, in that my conscious experience doesn't bring that wall into existence. When I leave
Well,
the
you cannot.
house,
Yes, you cannot run it through the wall. That's correct. But that doesn't mean that the wall exists in a way how you perceive it, how you would say it, how you would describe it. That just means when you try to run through the wall and then you bump your nose, you get a certain kind of experience. Right? That's what you sort of say. That your consciousness has this certain kind of experience, this bump experience. I can't go further, but that doesn't automatically entail that you have that you sh- that you must take, or that you need to take the description that you come up with this situation, which is the description in terms of, oh, there's a physical wall like 3 meters in front of me, that you have to take that seriously, that you have to believe that reality really is like that. The only thing which, so to say, uh, is non-negotiable is that you bump your nose.
right, and that's just electrostatic repulsions between particles, and that's perceived as consciousness in some abstract way, and that we've tied all that together to be
Yes, I
reality.
would say that the electromagnetic repulsion, or the electrostatic repulsion that you feel, that's part of the, so to say, story which we have constructed in order to make sense of this situation.
Right. So
It's a
so
very good
what?
story. It's an objective story. It's not just a story which I can come up with, like when I write a fiction book or something like that. No,
Yes.
um, it's really
It's a
more
high
than that.
fidelity story. If I run into the wall 100 times, it's gonna hurt each time, and each time it's going to, yeah. Okay. So what can we say, or can we say anything about the objective nature of reality? I guess the big question.
Yes. Exactly, that's a big question. So if we are, I mean, if you want to entertain something like the interface theory, then a natural question would be, but what is it beyond the interface, so to say, that we are experiencing? What lies beyond all those nice icons and stories and whatever, however you want to call it? And there are many options which you can go. And one of the options which I actually tend to like is to say that beyond those interface representations, there lies this domain or this realm of consciousness, agency, um, certain, let's call, um, mind forms or patterns, um, which you maybe can access, or which show up to you in the familiar ways how you would experience a normal world.
Can you
But of course, that's not
explain?
the. Oh, sorry, that was a bit too complicated, I guess. So
Just
I
explain that
would
a little
just say,
bit more.
okay. So when you ask yourself when you have an interface, and then you might have this natural question, well, but what am I interfacing with? What is it that the interface connects with? And um, one, I would say one not necessarily logically entailed thing, but in my opinion, very fruitful and an interesting way of thinking would be to say, okay, well, consciousness is really what's behind those interfaces. And consciousness is that what we're interfacing with. And then you might critically ask some questions, and I would say, okay, well, it's slightly different from the way how we understand consciousness. It's a what people would call a non-dual way of thinking about consciousness, something which is beyond those distinctions to subjects and objects, which includes also agency and various other kinds of things. But maybe that's going a bit too far at the moment. Okay.
So does consciousness is consciousness more fundamental than physics?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Definitely.
So physics would be something like a top level description, maybe, or a very simplified description of the dynamics of consciousness as it happens. Consciousness unfolds in a certain kind of way, and it's an interesting question whether we can theorize about that or not. But physics, in any case, physics would be something like a very simplified description of what's really going on.
So the Big Bang occurs 13.8 billion years ago. One microsecond after the Big Bang, is there consciousness? Because if before consciousness there was nothing, consciousness needed to play a role in the Big Bang, or I know we're getting very strange here, but how does consciousness interact with the Big Bang and the beginning of the universe?
Well, if you believe that space and time are not fundamentally real, then this whole idea of, well, there was the Big Bang 30.6 million years ago, and then something happened, becomes a very questionable way of talking. I mean, it's something which presumes or presupposes that you have a well-ordered space and time framework in place. So this question is not really where is consciousness within this structure where you have the Big Bang and then stuff happens, and where consciousness, so to say, where did consciousness play a role here, and when did it start to? But it's really more about thinking, okay, this whole story, there was this Big Bang, and then you have this kind of nice physical evolution, is something which happens in consciousness, so not the other way around.
So again,
So in
it's
one
sort of
sense, consciousness is already there when you think about the Big Bang, but it's not like consciousness can be located within the space-time story which starts with the Big Bang.
so. So do you think that the Big Bang happened?
Yes, of course. Well, what do you mean when you ask the question? Do you believe that this happened?
Do you believe the physical event of the rapid expansion of the universe as described by the best physics models that we have for the Big Bang, does that run into the interface theory of perception and the conscious agent theory, or do they work together?
Well, I would say there is something which happened, and I don't know what happened. But if you represent it in a way that we humans typically think, or that our interfaces, so to say, evolved in, then it would look like something which the physicists tell you that the Big Bang, which looks like the Big Bang. But of course, there might be that cosmology changes in 50 years or so, and we don't no longer believe in the Big Bang. I have no idea about that, maybe. But I would say, according to the, so to say, the best knowledge that we currently have in physics or in cosmology, definitely something happened. But we were presented as some kind of initial event many billion years ago. But that presupposes a certain way of structuring reality, of representing reality. And that kind of structure of representation that we, so to say, use to make sense of reality need not be truthful in this sense of that I outlined before.
It's so cool. It's quite mind melting. It's
I
a
would say
fun thing
yes
to be
and
able
no.
to work on every day.
If I say something like these things here, they do not really exist, then I would also need to say like, okay, the Big Bang in some sense didn't really exist, but of course I also believe that there is something significant that is referred to with this. So I also believe that there is something very significant which is referred to with this icon.
I guess that the point of a good explanatory framework like the interface theory of perception or conscious agent theory is that it allows you to make testable hypotheses, set up experiments, and see if those experiments align with these ideas. What kind of experimental paradigms do you get to experiment with when you make such grand claims about the universe? And I'm not using grand in an unfounded way there, but they are quite strange. They're quite unreal, literally. Like, what sort of experiments do you run to test the ideas of consciousness being fundamental?
I think there are, well, at least three directions you can follow here. Um, One is a direction of physics. So if you're interested, some people, Don and some other collaborators are very interested in this question. What are particles, for example? Um, then one prediction would be if you take conscious agent theory. Um, if you look at the theory, then you can make certain correspondences between what's happening in the theory, between the dynamics of the theory and what we observe as so-called physical particles, physical events. So that's one area. A second area is this notion of space and time. Um, I just said the whole idea of space and time is a clever way how we represent data with our interface. Um, of course, the question is how in detail would you spell it out? And here the interface theory of perception suggests that it has something to do with the way how we with that it has something to do with fitness, so with the way how we choose certain actions, how we can choose certain actions. So there's this proposition that space and time are like error correcting codes. You might have heard about that in computer science. Um, yeah, in a computer, you always have the problem. You have these bits, and bits can randomly flip, so to say. So if you design a computer, you have to make sure that the information which you want to process in your computer is actually quite faithful. So you constantly have to correct for certain errors, which correspond to those accidental bit flips. One proposition of the interface theory is that space and time work very similar, but um, there are no bit flips here, but there are changes in fitness, and uh, you need to find very stable ways of interacting in the world, and that's where space becomes very, very useful. Another area where the interface theory of perception uh, might lead to interesting results, and that interests me very much, is this question of consciousness and AI. What does it
Mm.
mean that computers can be conscious? So, according to the interface theory, one is somewhat skeptical um, with respect to this whole idea that, well, you have computations, and if you put them together, and if it's complex enough, then you will get a conscious system. But still, there might be, so even if the interface theorists would disagree with that, and a lot of people actually believe that now, but the interface theorists would be very skeptical, say, nah, probably not. There's still this very interesting question how we can make representations which tell us something about consciousness. Um, so how can the AI do something like the things that we can do with our brain? That's still a very valid question. But the framing of the problem is a bit different. It's not about finding those computations which eventually emerge consciousness, but it's looking for those computations which allow you to create interesting interfaces with consciousness. So that could also enable you to see consciousness where you actually can't see it now. So my hope would be that with AI or with technology, we really get into a state where we can see certain patterns emerge that we couldn't normally perceive, which are indicative of consciousness.
Very cool, very cool, and well laid out on the three different areas. I think if you go to most textbooks, high school, secondary school, whatever country you are, you'll find a brief section on consciousness in the biology chapter. I'm getting the sense from you that you don't think consciousness has anything to do with biology at all.
Um, yes and no. I think that depends. That's the slippery slope. It depends a bit on how you use this word consciousness. If you believe consciousness is something fundamental to reality, then it kind of is a bit bigger than confining it to a section in a biology textbook. If you look for what in the beginning of our discussion, what I refer to as access consciousness, you might say, okay, that's a very specific biological property that certain complex maybe neural systems or other information processing systems in nature could actually develop. And that's a very specific biology-like question. So there is, again, these two different senses on how you can use the word consciousness. And that's just very coarsely. You have these two senses, but they're probably much more than two.
Yes. But where do you stake your flag? Because you're like, if you stand by the ideas that you've been talking about, surely it does go in the physics chapter, or maybe an entirely new chapter and an entirely new category needs to be made for it, and it doesn't fit into any of the buckets that we've already sort of neatly discretized and laid out. Do you think it's entirely its own category? Does it fit into physics? Is it philosophy? Is it kind of all things?
Probably it's philosophy, but so one interesting question is, of course, this question how all these different chapters in your textbook related, and the relation between those things are very close to consciousness. In some sense, it's the way how we perceive consciousness, maybe in the world. It's not. I'm not saying something like, "Oh, consciousness is the relation between those things." I think that you can't say that there's a slight difference between consciousness and the relations between those things, but consciousness shows itself as those relations. So it's a kind of the interface representation. If you don't want to limit those interfaces to individual brains, then you could say something like, okay, that's how consciousness shows up. But it's really more fundamental than whatever is written as a content in those textbooks, so to say.
And do you have any? I know that we don't know. Of course, we don't know, but we have some, or maybe we don't have some idea what particles and fields are. Do we have any idea what physically, like, is consciousness material to you? Like, does it emerge from something material, even if it's the most fundamental thing? Is that still material? Is it still emerging from something that exists materially?
Well, it depends a bit on how you define material. But if you define material in the sense, if you say what is material, the things which you can touch and grab and see and look at, independent of yourself, then I would say no, consciousness is not a material phenomenon. If you just define material as whatever is objectively there, so to say, then I would say, oh, well, okay, and consciousness is material. Or even material is consciousness.
Yeah. You're
So
kind
it
of
really
frying my
depends
brain.
how you think. But I would say one important one way to kind of wrap your head around this would be to say, um, can I think about one in the absence of the other? And typically we would say, okay, there is material stuff and then there is consciousness, but there can be material stuff, of course, without consciousness. So you have the Big Bang, and then maybe it took millions and billions of years until you evolved certain life forms, which evolved certain senses of consciousness. So there was a long time where you had kind of material stuff happening without consciousness. And that's not something which I would subscribe to.
Do you think that there will be a experimental finding in your lifetime in the next couple of decades that will say that will really figure out some fundamental nature of consciousness. Like sometimes it's difficult to even know what an experimental finding would look like in this field. Is it a computational model? Is it an algebraic formula? Is it a data point, a biological data point? Like, what does experimental data in that would enlighten us about consciousness even look like? Like, what form would it take?
Yeah, that's it. So questions about the future are always very, very difficult. So if you ask me what I expect in my lifetime to see something, I hope, but I don't know, of course. Um, so I would say when you have a good theoretical or computational model of consciousness, how consciousness shows up on your interface, so to say, and you can explain interesting findings that you observe happening around the world, so to say, or in space and time, and you can link that to your underlying model of consciousness, then that would provide some good evidence for your model of consciousness, especially if those findings are hard or very difficult to explain otherwise. So what you typically can do, and that's a historical thing which always happened, is that whenever you had evidence, you can shoehorn the evidence, so to say, into the old existing models. But at one point, that you can always make this epicycle, so to say, and typically you can always make this work. But at one point in time, people start to feel a bit uncomfortable with this strategy. They say, well, that's kind of artificial. So if,
Right.
on the contrast, you have a model of consciousness, how it projects into the interface, and then you will find experimentally some things which are actually explained by that, then it would be good evidence for your model.
So you do fundamentally believe that consciousness is computable, because I think if you listen to now, I definitely don't understand the full breadth of the Roger Penrose's idea of the quantum nature of consciousness, but I believe sort of one of the things that he states in that idea is that consciousness might not be fundamentally computable at all. That there is some mathematical ideas that aren't computable based on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I am lots of things I don't understand. But
Yeah.
do you think consciousness is fundamentally, is it computable? Can you have it on a computer?
So I'm very open actually to this issue, whether computable or uncomputable. I must say I'm quite sympathetic actually to people like Roger Penrose believe it's not computable. So it's but it could be just my limited imagination, so to say. But when I don't know, when we do mathematics, like the example of Gödel, for example, if we come up with interesting stuff, then that seems to be at least very not intuitive to me how that could be the result of a certain algorithmic procedure which is running. So I don't know. So in conscious agent theory, to be a bit more specific, and that's really then the question about this particular model, there are certain computable processes, but most processes which are going on there are actually not computable. Uh, but there's still this question whether how important those processes are and how they show up. And the previous question you asked me about what would be the evidence, and here I'm not super clear. I don't really, I cannot really predict how those uncomputable things which are happening in the formalism are really very important to understand it. In the end, I would say whether something is computable or not is a question of our interface representation of it. How I mean, it's a distinction which plays out on the interface, so to say. Um, but I'm not sure whether it's any way indicative of some distinction which you can draw on the level of consciousness itself.
Right. How does quantum mechanics fit into your framework? Do you believe that consciousness is a quantum mechanical phenomena?
Well, I would say if you um, if you look at consciousness, or if you represent consciousness in your interface, then ultimately that should look like something which we would call quantum mechanical. So the way how consciousness behaves, so to say, how it manifests in the world, should have these quantum properties. Otherwise, it would be very strange. If you take up this framework. But that doesn't necessarily say that consciousness itself is a quantum mechanical phenomenon. Basically says, oh, consciousness, it might be that, or probably the case, that consciousness is still deeper or more fundamental than quantum mechanical phenomena. But just one particular lens of looking at consciousness through one particular lens results in something which looks like quantum mechanics.
Okay. So consciousness might even be more fundamental again.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Makes sense. I was listening to, are you familiar with someone called Federico Fagin? He's the founder of the microprocessor.
Yes. Yes.
He has this idea that I also don't understand. Lots of things I don't understand in this conversation. He has this idea of quantum fields being conscious, a sentence that I don't understand. What does it mean for a quantum field to be conscious? And do you think that there's some merit to this idea? Does this run in the face of conscious agent theory? Because again, it's placing maybe quantum mechanics and consciousness on the same level, but you think consciousness is even more fundamental. What do you think of this idea of quantum fields being conscious? And is it possible to explain that using simple terms?
So I guess I'm maybe I'm misrepresenting some things that Federico says, and so I think he has in some sense there's a great affinity between the things he says and we say, namely the great affinity being that consciousness is fundamental and things emerge out of consciousness. Now, this point that you came up with, the question whether quantum fields are conscious, I'm not 100% sure that I understand what it actually means.
Okay,
I
me
can
and you
just
both. That's
tell you
okay.
from the perspective of the interface theory, space and time are interface representations. So in some sense, the quantum field is a way how consciousness manifests itself or shows up. If you want to use this language, shows up on certain interfaces. So in that sense, you wouldn't want to say that the quantum field as such is conscious, but it comes from consciousness. But again, I'm not 100% sure that I completely understand what Federico Fagin is actually saying here. But be that as it may, I think there's a great affinity in saying that consciousness is fundamental, and it has this very fundamental nature, so you need to connect it to quantum mechanics ultimately.
Okay, so you're sympathetic to the idea that significant advances in the field of consciousness might be made through the study of quantum mechanics.
Yes, and the other way around, actually. So significant advances in the study of quantum mechanics might be made through the
Wow,
study of
that's
consciousness.
cool.
So I think that's very important, because historically, it's a muddied thing, and a lot of people said, yeah, well, there's this connection between consciousness and quantum mechanics. Certain quantum phenomena, they're kind of indicative of consciousness, unique consciousness. But I would say I would go even one step further. If you really want to make progress on certain issues in quantum mechanics, you might want to look at consciousness. So it's not just like, consciousness should be informed by quantum mechanics. It should be really the other way around. It probably should be the other way around.
What what do you think psychedelics reveal about consciousness when somebody takes psychedelics? Does that somehow strip away the interface? Does that give us a grasp at the more objective reality, or is that again just an icon and we're fooling ourselves that psychedelics bring us any closer to the truth than we normally experience day to day?
So I would say one of the things that I would say with respect to psychedelics and also other, let's say, mind or consciousness engineering practices like meditation, for example. I mean, there are many different different ways, is to say they show you the limitations of your interface. So when you take, for example, when you take psychedelics, I mean, this whole idea, oh, we're kind of these creatures bound in space and time, and that's really disappearing. So you might have this sense, you can go everywhere you want. You are not limited to this particular physical space-time setup that you're used to. And in that sense, I think we learned something very good, very truthful. But on the other hand, this idea that when you use psychedelics or when you do meditation or whatever, you learn about the, so to say, truthful way how consciousness is in and of itself. That's a bit dangerous. I think that's beyond what we could actually say ultimately. But there's a difference between having the psychedelic experience and talking about the psychedelic experience that you have.
Yes.
Certainly, those kind of experiences let you see this construction of an interface representation in a very fundamental way, namely in the sense how it breaks down.
Do you think the fact that psychedelics do alter our consciousness to such a great extent, is that not good evidence that consciousness is a brain phenomena?
Why should it be specifically good evidence that it's a brain phenomenon?
Well, psychedelics act on our serotonin system in some way that we don't fully understand. It's changing brain circuits. It's altering the connectivity between different regions. And it seems like, again, this may be just an illusion, it seems like a function of that connectivity shift and serotonin system shift that our consciousness is shifting. So it seems causal. Again, it could be that I'm just falling into the hallucination that that's a causal link. But, again, there's a sense that really feels causal, that it's the brain phenomena, that it's the psychedelics that are really altering that conscious experience.
So you definitely have a correlation between what you experience and what your brain is doing.
Yes.
I wouldn't dispute that. I'm just not sure how that is indicative of a causal relation between what the brain is doing and what you're experiencing. So certainly you have a lot of interesting correlations between those two things, but it's a question how to explain those correlations.
Yes.
And I'm not sure whether psychedelics in and of themselves, they would suggest some kind of explaining those things and not another one.
So do you have a idea of what psychedelics are doing then? Because I think I would guess that the mainstream idea is that consciousness does emerge from the brain and that psychedelics does have a causal change on that consciousness because of its effects on the brain. What would
Right.
be your idea of what psychedelics are actually doing?
So, I mean, this time I'm not a psychedelic researcher, so I'm a layman basically. But if I would if I would guess based on what I know about the interface theory, I would say, okay, psychedelics modulate the kind of relations that you perceive in the world, and that shows up as a different kind of experience that you have. Um, so the brain is constantly relating things to each other, and that corresponds or correlates again to a particular kind of experience. So if you change the relations here, then you would expect that you would also change some of the contents that you experience or not. But nevertheless, the fact that you experience something here, yeah, I mean that's still as mysterious as ever. So I don't think psychedelics, in some sense, is a way around this problem, this fundamental problem.
Do you think that we can learn anything about the nature of consciousness from psychedelic research?
Oh, hmm. Yes, I mean, I wouldn't. I wouldn't rule it out. So I mean, it sounds very negative if you always say, "Oh, you have this correlation," but they don't tell you anything about. Of course, they tell you a lot about how the contents that you consciously experience are structured or can be, how those structures can be changed, and I think that's very valuable to understand in and of itself. So it's really, it's not just some stuff that's going on in your brain. It's how you experience while there's stuff which is going on in your brain, so to say. Um, so it seems to me, it strikes me that a lot of research that's currently done in psychedelics is very focused on what's actually happening inside your head, so to say.
Yes.
Um, whereas this second aspect, what's happening inside your experience, so to say, is often a bit marginalized nowadays, I would say. And that's really where psychedelic research might be most profitable in terms of mental health research, I guess. So the experiences themselves are this kind of sometimes catalyzing, sometimes not catalyzing, but reinforcing ways of perceiving reality.
It really seems like we have a bit of a language problem when it comes to consciousness,
Mhm.
insofar as it means probably 20 different things at least. Do you think that we need to construct new words to describe the different aspects of consciousness? Because having just one word is just really confusing the conversation about what people are even talking about when they say it. Because phenomenological consciousness is just maybe a different thing to access consciousness, to content consciousness. Like, we might just need actually different labels to describe these things, and people are getting very confused because they're saying the word consciousness, but two people don't mean the same thing at all when they say it.
Yes, I think on the one hand, I think that's a problem. On the other hand, I think that if you go to consciousness researchers themselves, most of them are actually quite knowledgeable about these different senses the word consciousness is used to. I mean, it's still the question, what kind of aspect of consciousness do I want to talk about? Um,
Yes.
maybe maybe I have a theory, one is using a theory which can only talk about one particular aspect. And then it would be very nice if you can say, it's only that. But it's probably not the case. Um, but for a general audience, it's certainly confusing. There's this one word which has different connotations in different contexts. And as a layperson, you sometimes do not really know what the guy is talking about in some other, when it comes to some other aspects, and what you often, yeah, and that's even a problem which makes it even more difficult, that you have this, often you have this tactic that you kind of introduce the study that you do, the thing that you want, that you're researching with a general term,
Yeah.
but then you only talk about one aspect, and it seems as if the conclusions were entailing some things about other aspects, which might not be quite um,
Right.
rigor- rigorously true. So there's
Like,
a
I think
problem in
this
that.
extends far beyond consciousness, even to, these words were invented by the ancient Greeks, right? And we haven't changed them to, we haven't expanded out to the words to all the different brain phenomena that we've discovered. So even when people talk about attention, or they talk about focus, or even basic things like memory or emotion, these are very multifaceted concepts. And attention, I don't know if that is one thing. Again, there's many different forms of attention, there's many different forms of memory, and it seems like brain phenomena really fail at the language level because we haven't parsed these things apart and given them very descriptive functions, because they're so different, they're so wide encapsulating.
Yes, I think that's a general problem. I would say it's even a bit worse in the case of consciousness, because with consciousness you have this kind of broad two different senses in the first sense in being, or consciousness, what is some, like the brain, what is the brain actually doing, or what are the functions which are carried out. And on the other hand, you have this sense of consciousness which is really opposite, which is, but there's also this sense of consciousness in what it feels like, what's subjective, what is it what it's subjectively like. So maybe a bit simplifying would be to say, okay, there's one way in which you objectivize consciousness, and then there's another sense in which consciousness refers to some subjective experience. So there seems to be very different types of things.
Right.
And to make bridges between those two things seems to be very difficult.
Right. Yeah, for sure. To step away from the sort of massive intellectualizing and theories for a second,
Mhm.
how do you live your life and orient your decisions in under this framework of everything I see is false, is an icon. The reality isn't how I perceive it. Consciousness is fundamental. Knowing these things, does it change how you actually make decisions, how you live your life, how you feel happiness, how you feel, there's one interpretation of this could be quite nihilistic, that everything is sort of a false reality. We can't be in touch with the universe in any real sense. What's your takeaway from your explorations into consciousness in terms of how it guides your life?
I would say one important distinction, which everyone probably knows, is this distinction between knowing and actually doing something, and knowing about something and really experiencing something. Those are two different things, right?
Right.
So it usually takes a lot of time until this kind of what you're intellectually aware of, so to say, manifests in the way how you lead your daily life. But I guess everyone is familiar with that problem. Now, notwithstanding that, um, I, I I would say that one of the benefits that I experience when thinking about this interface theory of perception is really this thought of, okay, some of the distinctions that I make in my life, which I take to be very categorical, um, might really be just distinctions in the way how I perceive the world, and not in the way how the world really is. Um, so one of the I think one of the general benefits of something like the interface theory would be to say, okay, um, you you kind of tend to uh, diminish these distinctions that you see in the world, and I think that's a good thing. Um, Now, the second aspect which you mentioned is this kind of nihilistic outlook that, oh yeah, there is no reality, and everything is kind of pointless. Um, that's something which you might infer from the interface theory of perception, um, which I find very difficult to actually sustain, which I would find very difficult to sustain in my daily life. I think that's not the point of the interface theory. The point of the interface theory is really not to say, oh, there is no such thing as reality, but it's really more about saying, oh, the way how we think reality is really not the way how reality actually is. And especially, and that's this further point, that when it comes to consciousness, there seems to be something about consciousness that plays a role here. So there is something like a real world outside of the interface, so to say, and it has to do with consciousness. I think
Right.
that's the more important lesson to the interface theory, rather than the, let's say, nihilistic version which you kind of outline.
I definitely don't subscribe to the nihilistic worldview either. I think it's phenomenally amazing, the types of ideas that you play with on a daily basis. And for me, it just gives me an insatiable curiosity to learn about the world. It motivates me to learn because probably the reality is just so much more interesting than we know. Undoubtedly, the reality of these things, once you dig deeper, once you learn about the consequences and the implications, it's just so much more fascinating, and that's very motivating for me. But I'm always just curious to know what are the takeaways when you have these researchers that have these incredible frameworks for how the universe works. How does that actually guide their decisions on a day-to-day basis? They have this really grand big idea of how the world works, and it's really quite different to how most people just think how the world works. does that influence how you live your life? I've spoken to a few consciousness researchers like Christoph Koch, and he's a vegan, and he credits his veganism to his study of consciousness. It's given him sort of a deeper empathy with, all types of organisms, because, he believes that pretty much maybe all organisms are in some way conscious, and that makes it, a sin to eat flesh, and that's how he described it. And that was an interesting takeaway. So I'm always kind of curious what the takeaway is and what the practical. How do you guide your life with this just magnificent idea that you have?
So I was once at a conference like 10 years ago or so, and I remember that I talked to a colleague at this conference, and then I expressed my amazement. Well, I'm a vegetarian myself, and then I confessed to him my amazement that there are many people, or mostly philosophers actually there, because then it was only popular among certain breed of philosophers, so to say, to take consciousness as fundamental, but then not at all be kind of worried what it's entailed in terms of the diet.
Right.
So I found that I already found it amazing. So I think the example of Christopher, it's a very nice example. It's a
Yeah.
very good one. I'm often not sure whether the things that you do because you believe certain things, or whether you believe certain things because of the things that you do. So I'm not sure
Right.
what's the flow, so to say, what's the causal flow in these stories. Um, and I would say, consistent with the interface theory, maybe a weird way of seeing those things is, I would say, what's happening in your mind, what's happening up here, so to say, expressed in a way that you behave, or is mirrored in terms of the interface theory. So all the things or many of the things that happen to you in your life are really just expressions of your state of mind. It's not like, oh, you have this idea and then you derive certain conclusions about what to do and what not to do.
Yes.
You do whatever you want to do, so to say, and that tells you something about how your mind works.
Yes, that makes complete sense. Let's go to AI and consciousness to finish off, because you touched on it briefly. You said it was an area that interested you, and obviously it's incredibly topical at the moment. It's impossible to go on X or go through a newspaper feed or anything without seeing some general statement that AGI is coming in the next 12 months, in the next 18 months. A new AI tool has been released. It's an incredibly exciting time for AI development, and scary for a lot of people as well. Um, do you think that AI can be conscious?
I, Given the interface theory, I would definitely say that when you have a large language model, for example, and you train it on millions of written sentences and words, um, that it encodes a lot of meanings, conscious meanings that we came up with. So in that sense, I would say definitely yes. But in the sense that, well, so again, given the interface theory of perception, this idea that I'm a certain person living at a certain place in time, that might be actually not true. I'm conscious. That's true. Of course, I cannot doubt that. But all of the other stories which I tell myself, so to say, um, they might be they might be wrong. So I'm a conscious self, so to say, where self written large, um, and 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 I would say it's perfectly reasonable to assume that an AI could actually come up with the same narratives or with the same stories. Uh, I think that there's no question. Um, Again, when you ask me whether I would believe that certain computations they just lead to the emergence of consciousness, then I would be very skeptical. But regardless of that, I would say, okay, the AI comes to a very similar, let's call it, psychological organization that I have. That might be true, might not be true. I don't know. I'm not an AI researcher. Maybe there's more than just things that can be done on a digital computer. I don't know. And maybe you need to undergo certain biological processes for that. I have no idea. But in principle, I think, yes, that's possible.
Very interesting. That I don't
But
think that is the. Well, it's hard to know if that's the minority or the majority opinion at the moment. Do you think that that is the minority or the majority opinion?
yeah, I'm always, actually, it's as you said, it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Um, so I would want to connect it what you say to this nihilistic outlook of the interface theory of perception, which I think is not true, but which you might kind of believe that that's the case.
Yes.
There's also a kind of nihilistic outlook with respect to AI. And that question would be, well, what should I do? What is it all good for? Probably in 10 years or in 5 years, the AI will do whatever I do, will do it much better and much cheaper. So maybe even when it comes to science or to mathematics at one point in time, AI will greatly surpass us, and there's just no sense in living in this world, so to say. And here I would say it's very important um, to channel this whole, let's say, promise of AI or this whole power of AI into something which I would deem useful or which I would deem good, and that's the exploration of consciousness.
So do you think that if you think AI can be conscious, do you think any models that have been released to date can be considered conscious under your interface theory?
Well, I wouldn't actually say they are conscious. I would say um, that artificial intelligences could be uh, a manifestation of consciousness, such as I and my brain are a manifestation of consciousness. It
Right.
doesn't mean that it is conscious or that it produces consciousness, but I also wouldn't say that my brain is conscious, so to say. My brain is an interesting representation of certain processes which are going on, which are indicative of consciousness. But that doesn't mean that inside my brain there is something like consciousness or so. And in the same sense, I would say that could be true for AIs and also maybe for already existing AIs. But again, one has to be somewhat cautious. There are certain things that probably certain things that conscious systems or brains can do, which AIs can't do. So in that sense, there might be a clear difference. Um, But again, I mean, the devil is in the detail, and I would say that's not a qualitative difference, in the sense that maybe even very simple AI systems have uh, maybe a very alien or different sense of consciousness. But it's not their consciousness. It's a more
Right.
It's a way of accessing a more fundamental realm of consciousness.
Right. I feel like I keep using the language of consciousness of a typical neuroscience model, which is that the brain has consciousness or a system is conscious, rather than the interface theory really again is putting consciousness more fundamental and saying that a system is the manifestation of consciousness or consciousness acting upon that system in some sort of emergent way. Again, consciousness is always fundamental. Consciousness comes first. So it's not system, then consciousness. It's always consciousness and then system.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to say it. So even this whole notion, there is a system of something, is basically just the way how we simplify speaking about consciousness or simplify certain things that happen inside of consciousness.
So then, with that in mind, it's quite difficult to know how to think about AI and consciousness. What, like, under that framework where it's not down to just the AI becoming more and more sophisticated, and there's a line, and above that line it's conscious, and below that line it's not conscious, which isn't in any way conducive with
Yeah.
your theories. How can we think about conscious AI and consciousness and artificial intelligence under this framework that consciousness already exists, possibly within these AI systems, and it's just not manifesting in a way that we realize, or it gets very complicated to even understand how to think about AI and consciousness under this sort of framework.
Yes, I would try to frame it the following way. So, um, let's say any possible form of consciousness already exists, and then we pick it out using certain AI systems. And maybe
Right.
we can engineer AI systems in a way that we want to pick out certain forms of consciousness which are already pre-existing, so to say.
Right.
Uh, but we don't create them, so to say. We pick them.
Yes.
We maybe we channel them, or to use a different metaphor. Um, I think
Can you give
that's the way of thinking it. Think how I would think about it.
Yes. Can you give an example of what that might be? Like how might consciousness or might how might an AI system pull out an aspect of consciousness that's observable for us? Can you give some sort of concrete example of what that might be?
Well, I mean, we don't have good candidates where we would where most people would actually agree that it's a good example of AI consciousness. So it's I have to speculate. It's difficult. But if you just take a large language model, for example, there's certainly no sense in which you have a unified subjective perspective which is associated with such a thing. But still, there is a way in which you can say that the large language model encodes various kinds of meanings of different conscious subjects, namely the humans which came up with the training data initially. So in that sense, it already picks out some representations of consciousness, but in a different sense, namely in the sense that it brings them together into a unified, coherent, subjective um, thing, view. That's not the case at the moment. Um, and that's why I said, okay, it might be that our current AI systems already instantiate this very alien version of consciousness in a sense. Okay, they are based on whatever they are based on, but according to the interface theory, that's ultimately a manifestation of consciousness. So in that sense, one can say, okay, they are related to consciousness, or they are consciousness, but they're not consciousness in a sense that they really instantiate um, their own subjective phenomenal point of view.
Do you think that there's a particular way that we could build AI models that would, I'm trying to get my phrasing right here so that it agrees with your theory, that it would manifest a greater amount of consciousness than the AI models today? So I've spoken to a few computational neuroscientists about this really
Yes.
interesting idea of a simulated agent theory. You have an
Mhm.
agent in a complex environment, and then it basically evolves through natural selection by putting it through different selection pressures. Do you think that by virtue of that sort of system and that training system, that would manifest more, that sort of model would manifest more consciousness than sort of this input output mapping at scale that we're doing with the current language models, like just predicting next word?
I would say the word more is a bit tricky. I mean, we talked about this measuring of consciousness and this scale of having more or less of it. I think that's a very tricky issue. But let's put that to a side. I mean, I think these two ingredients, which probably the people you talk to are kind of referring to, we're having a what's called a model or representation of oneself in an environment. And so to say, this relation between the self and the environment is what gets complexified and what can get complexified. And that's something which current AI technology is clearly not doing. So I think that could be, I'm not an expert here, I'm not a computational scientist myself, that could be one way to um, get closer to this what you or what I refer to as kind of accessing some pre-existing consciousness out there. I think that's a possibility. Whether that really will work, I don't know. But most people actually uh, who buy into that idea would conceive of saying, okay, this complexification which happens there between the self and the world model kind of emerges a sense of consciousness, and I
Yeah.
think that's not the right way to think about it.
Right.
That emerges a certain way of accessing a form of consciousness.
Right. Makes sense, I think. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. I really, really have loved it. It's truly mind melting. I am. I usually finish on a couple of questions that I would like to ask. So, what makes you most excited for the future of neuroscience?
The future of neuroscience. Um, well, it seems to me that I mean, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I, I, I somewhat have a bit of an outsider perspective on that. Um, but one thing which I find exciting about neuroscience is that in the last years, or maybe in the future, this idea that you can incorporate a lot of different ideas, a lot of different fields become relevant to the study of the brain. It's not only a physiological study, so to say, but it has implications for culture. It has implications for psychiatry, maybe, and various different things. So it's a new conception of what the brain is really doing, of mediating between lots of different things. And I think that's a quite exciting new development in neuroscience, which is a bit different from the um, way how people thought about it maybe 50 years ago.
I find it so funny that you say you're not a neuroscientist, but still in my framework that I have, it's like if you're studying consciousness, for me, it's like that makes you a neuroscientist, right? That is what that like that's still the sort
Well,
of framework that I have, and I think will take a very long time for me to ever, if ever, shift out of that. Is that for me? And it definitely borders on philosophy, so I'm a neuroscientist and philosopher. But for me, if you study consciousness, you are a neuroscientist. But I know that that is not, your framework and your idea on how that system works.
well, when I said I'm not a neuroscientist, I mean I don't have a degree in neuroscience.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. What's one book that you would recommend the listeners read?
Mm, that's a good question. Oh, maybe some old book, something like Plato, Timaeus, or something like that, an old Platonic dialogue to kind of see that a lot of these crazy ideas have been thought by many thinkers many years ago.
So, what do you think someone in 2025 gets from reading Plato?
Uh, Interesting new ideas, I would say. Um, Thinks a very different way of conceiving of the world, of thinking about reality. Um, I could talk about this a bit, but probably the time is running out. Um, but it seems to me there, someone like Plato, for example, or followers of Plato, they had a very rich uh, cosmology in place, which gradually got collapsed. Uh, First in modern times with Descartes, maybe, and even more collapsed in the 20th century, in the 19th century with the rise of materialism. Um, and to realize that there's a certain kind of richness which has already been thought by previous generations, can be quite stimulating, I think.
Amazing. I thought you were going to say A Case Against Reality, because that was the book that really introduced me to a lot of the ideas that we've been discussing today. And I still remember walking the beach in the winter in Ireland, listening to that book, and it just shattering my mind. And so it's been really fun to be able to get on a call and talk to you about all of the different ideas that didn't make sense. I think they make a little bit more sense, but I think it's normal for these ideas to not make complete sense. But
Actually, I was thinking about that book as well.
yeah,
I already teach it to my students here,
yes,
but then, so to say, I kind of switched to this maybe even a bit more provocating idea, that you might profit very much from reading old books as well. Yeah.
Robert, this has been
Well,
so
I would say
so
it was
much
a
fun.
tie between Hoffman and Plato.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm so excited for the future of your consciousness research and work. I'm going to be keeping in touch with it. I'll link everything below that I can to send people to you to what you're working on at the moment. Thank you so much. This has been so much fun, a really, really engaging conversation. I've learned a lot. You've melted my brain. My brain hurts more than it did 90 minutes ago, but I think that's a sign of a great conversation, and I'm really thankful for the work that you do and for giving me your time.
I thank you very much for this invitation and for this opportunity to speak with you and with your audience. I hope to reconnect at a later point. It was great.